Nina's hands would not stop shaking. The hymns had ended, the applause was roaring around her, but all she could hear was the sound of her own breath, ragged and shallow. She was 15, standing in the back pew of Maple Ridge's old church, clutching a cracked phone as though it were the only thing keeping her alive. At the front, beneath the stained glass windows glowing with soft morning light, Brenda Miller raised her plaque high Foster Parent of the Year, and smiled the smile that had charmed this entire town for years. The pastor beamed, the congregation clapped, and neighbors nodded to each other with pride. Brenda looked like kindness made flesh, but Nina knew better. She rose, heart pounding, her chair scraping against the wood floor. Heads turned. People whispered her name. The girl everyone had pitied since the fire a year ago. The girl who never spoke in public, was suddenly standing tall with a phone in her hand. She tapped the screen, and the sound that followed silenced the entire sanctuary. A man's voice, rough and unmistakable. "Bring her to the warehouse tonight." The words dropped like stones into water, ripples spreading across every pew. The old organ pipes seemed to shudder. A child whimpered. Someone coughed sharply, as if to cut the tension. The sheriff, seated near the aisle, stiffened in his chair. His hand slid instinctively toward his retired K9 Ranger, lying at his boots. Ranger's ears perked, then a low growl rumbled from his chest. Brenda's smile never faltered. She turned slowly to face the congregation, her voice smooth as silk. "She's troubled. She doesn't understand what she's playing." She spread her hands as if to calm the storm, but her eyes sharp, calculating, locked on Nina with a warning only Nina could read. The pastor glanced from Brenda to the trembling girl in the back. Neighbors shifted uneasily, torn between the trusted woman in pearls and the orphan in a hoodie. Ranger's growl deepened, his teeth flashing. Nina gripped the phone harder, her voice breaking but firm enough to carry. "That voice is real. You all heard it. And if you won't believe me, then believe him." She pointed to Ranger. The German Shepherd barked, fierce and loud, echoing against the rafters. And just like that, Maple Ridge was no longer applauding its hero. It was holding its breath, waiting to learn if the child they had overlooked was about to tear their picture-perfect story apart. If you believe Nina deserves justice, hit like and comment "Justice for Nina." The echoes of Ranger's bark still rang in Nina's ears as the sanctuary dissolved into whispers and shifting feet. But her mind drifted elsewhere, to the night when everything she knew had burned away. She could still smell the smoke if she let herself. It had been past midnight in their small wooden house on the edge of Maple Ridge. One minute, she was dreaming of her mother's peach cobbler cooling on the counter. The next she was coughing, her lungs clawing for air. Flames painting the hallway with a violent orange glow. Her father's shouts cut through the roar. Her sister's cries filled the air. But then the ceiling cracked and the smoke pressed down. Nina remembered clutching the doorknob until it scorched her hand. Remembered stumbling out onto the porch barefoot as the fire swallowed the life behind her. By the time the sirens came, by the time neighbors huddled in their robes with buckets that did no good, her family was gone. She was left with ashes, a blackened scar across her wrist, and silence that stretched for days. In that silence, Brenda Miller appeared. The town saw her as an angel, a woman in pearls who came with warm blankets, promises, and a hand on Nina's shoulder. "You'll be safe with me," she had whispered at the funeral, her perfume cloying, her smile sweet. The townsfolk nodded approvingly. A girl with no family, no place to go, of course Brenda would take her in. It was what Brenda did. Nina, numb and broken, let herself believe. The first nights in Brenda's home seemed fine. A soft bed, clean pajamas, even a lamp that flickered gently when she turned it on. But quickly, the warmth cooled. School, which Brenda promised, never came. Instead, Nina scrubbed floors until her knees ached, ironed sheets until her arms trembled, and cooked meals she wasn't allowed to share. Other girls came and went, always quiet, always with shadows in their eyes. They would leave at night in cars that rolled up to the curb, and they returned at dawn, mascara smudged, shoulders slumped. Nina asked once where they went, and Brenda's hand landed heavy on her arm. "Don't ask questions, you're too young to understand." The look in Brenda's eyes froze her tongue. Still, Nina clung to hope. She told herself maybe Brenda was waiting. Maybe she needed to heal before she could start school again. She remembered how her mother used to stroke her hair at night and say, "Good things take patience." So she obeyed. She washed, folded, carried, scrubbed. But the hope wore thin, worn down like the soles of her shoes. Nights in Brenda's house were the worst. Locks clicked on the doors. Windows stuck tight. Sometimes she'd lie awake and hear the muffled sobs of other girls behind the thin walls. Once she pressed her ear to the plaster and heard Brenda's voice, low and commanding, promising men favors in exchange for envelopes of cash. Nina's stomach churned. She prayed for morning. Prayed someone would see past the mask. But no one did. The town saw only the pearls, the baked casseroles she carried to potlucks, the hymns she sang in church. No one saw the bruises hidden beneath sleeves. It was chance. Pure chance. That gave Nina her first glimpse of escape. One damp night, when Brenda left the back door ajar to take a phone call, Nina slipped outside. She ran until her lungs burned, until the pavement tore at her bare feet. She collapsed behind the old hardware store, sobbing, certain she would be dragged back. Instead, she found Clay Porter. He was locking up the shop for the night, his tall frame stooped by years, his face weathered but kind. He knew her at once. "Nina?" he whispered, crouching down. "Honey, what happened to you?" Words tumbled out between gasps. Fire, Brenda, the locked rooms, the whispers, the men. Clay's eyes darkened. He didn't doubt her, not for a second. He led her inside, gave her water, wrapped her in an old jacket that smelled faintly of tobacco and sawdust. "You're safe here," he said. "But we need to do this right." He called DFCS, the state agency for foster care, and pressed the receiver into her trembling hands so she could hear the official voice on the other end. For the first time in months, she felt like someone believed her. Clay kept her for a few nights in his spare room, his late wife's quilt tucked around her. He made pancakes in the morning. Strong coffee for himself. Hot cocoa for her. They watched local news on the small TV, the anchors smiling as though nothing dark ever happened in Maple Ridge. Nina caught herself wondering if maybe, just maybe, she could start again. But Brenda was clever. She told the neighbors Nina had run away in grief. That she was unstable. That she needed help. People nodded, clucking their tongues, offering Brenda sympathy. When Nina walked with Clay to the store, she saw the sidelong glances, heard the whispers. She was the broken girl, the liar, the burden. Brenda remained the saint. It was enough to make Nina doubt her own memory some nights, but then Ranger came. Clay introduced the retired K9 like he was an old soldier. The dog, gray around the muzzle but still strong, sniffed Nina's hands and settled at her feet as if he'd chosen her. From that moment, Ranger followed her everywhere. His watchful eyes grounding her when panic rose in her chest. When Brenda's truck prowled too close to the store, Ranger growled before Nina even saw it. When nightmares shook her awake, he pressed close. Steady as stone. Nina found herself whispering secrets into his fur. "She lied to everyone," she said one night. Tears dampening his coat. "But you know. You can smell it, can't you?" Ranger only sighed. But it was answer enough. In those fragile months, Nina began to believe she could fight. Clay reminded her often. His voice stern but gentle. "Truth always leaves a trail, Nina. People can bury it for a while. But it comes back up. Like roots under the pavement." She clung to that line, repeated it to herself when fear threatened to silence her again. Now, standing in the church with Brenda smiling at the pulpit and the town clapping, she thought of the fire, of the lies, of the cage she had lived in. Her hands shook, but not from weakness. They shook because she had carried too much truth for too long. And the trail was finally breaking through. Whispers followed Nina wherever she went in Maple Ridge after that Sunday morning at the church. She felt them like cold fingers brushing the back of her neck, even when the words were too soft to make out. The townsfolk had built Brenda Miller into a pillar of virtue, and tearing down a pillar made dust that clung to everyone. In the aisles of the grocery store, Nina caught the stares, saw the pity in some eyes and the doubt in others. "Poor girl," someone muttered once, just loud enough. Another voice, sharper. "She shouldn't slander a woman like Brenda." Clay walked beside her, stiff, backed, ignoring the looks, but she could feel his anger radiating with every step. At night she lay awake in his spare room, staring at the ceiling fan blades cutting shadows across the plaster, replaying the recording in her mind. Dan Waller's voice, "Bring her to the warehouse tonight," was etched into her skull. But her phone had been cracked for weeks and the file corrupted easily. What if no one else believed? What if Brenda found a way to erase even that shred of proof? The next morning, Clay set down his coffee mug with a thud and said, "We'll need more than a recording. Brenda's smart. She's had years to polish her story." He slid a notebook across the table. "Every detail you remember. Times, dates, names. Write it down. Truth leaves a trail." Nina wrote until her hand cramped, filling pages with moments that still clawed at her chest. The locked doors. The envelopes of cash. The smell of perfume and cigarettes that lingered on the men who visited. Clay nodded as he read, his jaw tight. He called Maria Lopez, a community lawyer known for standing up to officials who preferred silence. When Maria arrived, carrying a worn leather satchel and a face framed by determined dark curls, she didn't waste time on pleasantries. "If even half of what you've written is true," she said, "we're looking at trafficking. And cover-ups." Her gaze flicked to Clay. "You ready for the storm this will bring?" Clay didn't flinch. "Been in storms before. This one's overdue." Maria turned back to Nina, her voice softening. "I believe you. But belief won't be enough in court. We need hard evidence." Evidence. The word pulsed in Nina's ears. She thought of the other girls' faces she could barely recall. Their names whispered like secrets in the night. Some had cried into pillows, some had stared blankly at the floor. Where were they now? Would they speak if someone asked? Or had they already vanished into the same silence that had almost swallowed her? That week, Maple Ridge prepared for the annual Fall Festival, the event that drew everyone to the square with pumpkin pies, fiddles, and hayrides. Brenda was on the planning committee, of course, smiling at every meeting, handing out sign-up sheets, her pearls gleaming as if nothing had ever cracked her reputation. "She's doubling down," Maria said after attending one of those meetings. "That's what people do when they feel the ground shifting under them. She'll try to shine brighter, so no one looks at the shadows." Nina couldn't stop glancing at the gray pickup truck that began appearing near the school fence. Ranger always saw it first, stiffening, his growl vibrating through the leash until Nina followed his gaze. Dan Waller. The name hissed like steam in her mind. She had seen him before, heavyset, always with a ball cap pulled low, eyes that never softened. He had driven some of the girls away in that same truck. Once, he had glanced at her in Brenda's kitchen, and she had felt her stomach twist as though he had measured her for something she didn't want to imagine. Now he circled like a vulture, waiting. One afternoon Ranger barked so loudly that teachers came out to the parking lot. The truck sped away before anyone could approach. "He's not going to stop," Clay muttered, patting Ranger's head. "He's circling because he thinks Brenda still has a hold on you." Maria began digging deeper. She pulled county property records, asked questions about Brenda's foster license, even tracked down a former maintenance worker who had serviced Brenda's house. "Smoke detectors were unplugged," he told her. "I thought it was odd, but she said they kept beeping." Maria wrote it all down. Every crack mattered. At home Clay kept his old shotgun propped by the door, not for show but for the steady comfort it gave Nina to see it. He cooked suppers of fried chicken and mashed potatoes, telling her stories about Maple Ridge back when he was a boy. "Communities can be stubborn," he said. "But they're not blind forever. Once they see the truth, they can't unsee it." Yet the whispers didn't stop. At the diner, a man muttered to his wife, "That girl's just looking for attention." At church, someone placed a hand on Brenda's shoulder and prayed for her strength. Nina clenched her fists under the table, her nails digging into her palms. At night she whispered into Ranger's fur, "What if they never see? What if I'm the only one who knows?" The dog pressed close, warm and steady, and she thought maybe he did know. One evening, as the sun slid down behind the pines, Clay came in from the porch with a folded slip of paper. No return address. Just Nina's name scrawled in a familiar hand. She opened it with trembling fingers. The message inside was simple. Printed in block letters. "Come back or I'll tell them what you really are." Her vision blurred. The page shook. Brenda's threat was clear silence or ruin. "She's cornered," Maria said, gripping the paper. "This is intimidation. It means we're getting close." Clay's eyes burned. "It also means she's desperate." Nina couldn't breathe. What did Brenda mean? What you really are? She knew Brenda twisted stories, painted lies so sweet the town swallowed them whole. But what lie would she spin now? That Nina was unstable? That she was making up tales to hide her own faults? The thought made her skin crawl. "We'll prove it," Maria said firmly. "We'll show them who she really is." Nina looked out the window at Ranger lying on the porch, ears pricked toward the darkening road. The festival was only days away, and the town would gather in one place, trusting the very woman who had built her power on silence. Nina's stomach knotted with fear and resolve. Brenda was smiling in public, weaving her web tighter. Dan was circling like a shadow. The town was whispering, divided between truth and denial. And Nina knew the storm was coming, whether she was ready or not. The day of the fall festival dawned crisp and bright. The kind of October morning that made Maple Ridge look like a postcard. Pumpkins lined the courthouse steps, hay bales circled the square, and the air smelled of cinnamon and fried dough. Families spilled into the streets, children tugging at sleeves to reach the carousel, old men settling into folding chairs to hear the fiddlers. For Nina, the cheerful noise felt like a cruel disguise. Every booth and every smile reminded her of the mask Brenda wore so easily. The mask that fooled them all. Clay walked beside her, steady, his hand hovering near her shoulder as if to shield her from the crowd's stares. Maria Lopez trailed close behind, her satchel bumping against her hip, scanning faces as though she expected Brenda's allies to strike at any moment. Ranger trotted at Nina's side, his ears pricked, his gaze sharp. They stopped near the pie stand where Mrs. Carver waved them over with a sticky hand. "Pumpkin or apple, dear?" she asked. Her voice warm but her eyes darting toward Brenda, who stood near the stage arranging bouquets of chrysanthemums. Brenda was radiant in a burgundy coat, pearls gleaming at her neck, her laugh ringing above the music. Neighbors clustered around her, basking in her charm. Nina felt bile rise in her throat. "Not hungry," she muttered, pulling back. Clay thanked Mrs. Carver and steered her toward the edge of the square. "Remember," he whispered. "You're not alone. Eyes are opening, even if they don't show it yet." Nina wanted to believe him, but the whispers still lingered in her ears. The afternoon wore on with sack races, fiddles, and the smell of roasted corn. The sun slid lower, gilding the square in orange light. And then it happened. Brenda appeared at her side, sudden as a shadow. She slipped through the crowd, her hand clamping onto Nina's arm, fingers like iron. "We need to talk," she hissed, her smile frozen for the crowd. "Now." Nina's pulse spiked. She tried to pull back, but Brenda leaned in, her breath sickly sweet. "You're coming home with me. Right now." Ranger barked, teeth flashing, but Brenda yanked Nina toward the line of parked cars at the edge of the square. "Stop!" Nina shouted, but the music drowned her voice. People turned their heads, confused, unsure. Brenda's grip only tightened. The gray pickup truck rolled into view, engine rumbling. Dan Waller sat behind the wheel, cap pulled low, eyes glinting with recognition. He leaned across the seat, flinging the door open. "Get her in," Brenda snapped under her breath. Ranger lunged, jerking the leash from Clay's hand. The dog launched forward, planting himself in front of the truck, hackles raised, barking with the fury of a soldier back on duty. Dan cursed and revved the engine, the truck jerking forward, then slamming to a stop as Ranger refused to move. People screamed, scattering from the parking lot. The fiddlers faltered, the music breaking off mid-note. The sheriff, seated near the stage, shot to his feet, his hand flying to his belt. "Stop that truck," he roared. Chaos erupted. Brenda tried to drag Nina toward the open door, but the girl twisted free, her phone clattering to the pavement, the screen splintering. "She's lying!" Brenda screamed, spinning toward the crowd. "She's making this up to ruin me." The words rang across the lot, sharp and rehearsed. Neighbors gasped, some clapping hands to their mouths, some pulling children closer. Nina scrambled to her feet, her heart hammering. "It's the truth," she cried, but her voice cracked. She looked for her phone, saw it under the tire of a fleeing stroller. The glass shattering into useless shards. Her only proof. Gone. Panic surged in her throat. She saw the doubt spreading in the crowd, saw the old trust in Brenda's face still clinging to their memories. "Don't listen to her," Brenda shouted, tears springing to her eyes on command. "She's troubled. She needs help, not applause for her lies." For a moment Nina felt the ground tilt beneath her, the weight of the whispers crushing her chest. She had come too far, but now the evidence was gone, and the crowd was splitting. Some muttering sympathy for Brenda, others shaking their heads in confusion. Clay pushed through the circle, Maria at his side, both shouting for order, but their voices were drowned in the roar of panic and argument. The sheriff raised his hand, trying to cut through the noise. Ranger still stood guard, his barking relentless, holding the truck in place. Dan slammed his fists against the steering wheel, his face twisted in rage. Nina's knees buckled. She thought of the fire, of the nights locked in Brenda's house, of the girls who had disappeared into silence. If she failed now, their stories would die with hers. Her voice trembled as she whispered to herself, barely audible. "Maybe I've already lost." The crowd surged, divided, caught between the saint they had always trusted, and the girl with shaking hands who dared to accuse her. The sun slid behind the pines, shadows stretching long across the square, and Maple Ridge balanced once more on the knife's edge between truth and denial. The chaos of the festival left the town buzzing for days, but Nina carried only the memory of the phone crunching underfoot, her proof destroyed in an instant. She replayed the scene over and over. Brenda's tears. The gasps of the crowd. Dan's truck trapped by Ranger's furious stance. Some people had looked at her with pity. Others with doubt. But no one had stepped forward to say, "I believe you." The weight of that silence pressed down on her chest, heavier than the smoke that had once filled her lungs. Clay tried to steady her. He made hot cocoa that night, set the mug in her trembling hands, and said, "We're not finished. A story like Brenda's always leaves cracks. We just need to widen them." Maria paced the living room, her shoes clicking against the old wood floor. "The festival showed us something important," she said. Brenda panicked. Dan revealed himself. "That means they're desperate. Desperation breeds mistakes." Nina nodded numbly. But inside she felt hollow. Without the recording, she had nothing but words. And in Maple Ridge, Brenda's words still weighed more than hers. But the next day, a sliver of hope appeared. Clay remembered the smoke detectors. Months earlier, when he had stopped by Brenda's to drop off supplies, the maintenance worker had mentioned they were unplugged. He tracked down the man, an older technician named Willis. "She told me they kept beeping, said she'd handle it herself," Willis recalled, rubbing the back of his neck. "But I thought it was strange. State requires them working in foster homes. I logged it." Maria's eyes sharpened. "A log entry. Official timestamp. That's evidence. It proves negligence at the very least, and it ties to the fire Nina survived. If she disabled safety systems, it shows a pattern." Nina's heart thudded. A pattern. Something real. They arranged to meet Willis again. This time with Maria recording his statement. As the old man spoke into her phone, Nina felt a flicker of strength return. Brenda's mask was not flawless. Clay dug deeper, combing through files, records, even visiting the church office where the pastor kept old equipment. That was when the pastor, face pale with guilt, pulled a small plastic bag from a drawer. "I didn't know what to do with it," he admitted. "The doorbell camera at the church has been faulty for months. But the old memory card was still in it. I thought it was useless." Maria's fingers trembled as she slotted the card into her reader. The grainy footage showed Dan Waller's truck pulling into the church lot the morning of the award ceremony. The timestamp blinked clearly. They watched, silent, as the man stepped out, his cap low, and handed Brenda an envelope thick with bills. Brenda glanced around, then tucked it into her purse with practiced ease. The pastor buried his face in his hands. "She told me it was a donation. God forgive me. I believed her." Maria's voice was tight. "This isn't just negligence anymore. This is corruption. This is the proof we needed." Nina stared at the screen, at the woman who had stolen her childhood, smiling even as she pocketed bribes. Fury and relief tangled inside her, so strong she almost couldn't breathe. For the first time since the fire, she felt the scales tip in her favor. Sheriff Turner came that evening, summoned by Maria's urgent call. He stood in Clay's kitchen, reviewing the footage, listening to Willis's recorded statement. His jaw set like stone. "I've known Brenda my whole career," he said quietly. "Always thought she was a model citizen. But this is a different picture." Ranger lay at Nina's feet, his eyes fixed on the sheriff as though he, too, waited for the man to act. Turner finally nodded. "We'll move carefully. A warrant for the house, immediate investigation. But I need you ready, Nina. When this breaks, it'll be messy." Nina swallowed hard. "I've lived in the mess for years. I'm ready." The warrant came 2 days later. Sheriff Turner led the raid himself, Clay at his side, Maria close behind. Nina waited outside the house that had once caged her, her fists clenched, Ranger pressed against her legs. The front door splintered under the sheriff's knock, deputies pouring in. Shouts echoed through the walls. Within minutes they emerged with files, ledgers, a locked box stuffed with cash. Then came the girls, 2 of them, pale and trembling, ushered into the light by deputies who wrapped blankets around their shoulders. Nina's throat closed as she watched. She saw herself in their hollow eyes. The same fear. The same silence. One of them looked at her and whispered, "Thank you." Brenda was let out last, her wrists bound, her face still trying to muster that practiced smile. Cameras flashed local news had arrived. She raised her chin, as if she could still control the story. But Ranger barked once, sharp and final, breaking the illusion. Dan Waller was arrested that night in his truck, the same gray beast that had prowled near the school. The sheriff himself read him the charges. Nina watched from a distance as Dan was pushed into the cruiser, his curses muffled by the slam of the door. The town buzzed with shock. Neighbors who once whispered doubts now spoke in hushed tones of betrayal. The saint had been a serpent all along. But for Nina, the noise of the town didn't matter. What mattered was the moment the deputies stepped out of Brenda's house with those ledgers, those children. That proof of years of lies. The truth had clawed its way out, just as Clay promised it would. That night, back in Clay's kitchen, the three of them sat in exhausted silence. Maria poured coffee into chipped mugs, her hands trembling slightly. Clay stared at the table, his jaw slack with relief. Nina leaned against Ranger, tears streaking her face. But they were not tears of despair this time. They were tears of release. "It's over," Clay said softly. Though they all knew the trials, the court dates, the testimonies were still ahead. Nina shook her head. "No. It's just beginning. But now, people can't pretend anymore." Maria reached across the table, covering Nina's hand with hers. "You were brave enough to stand when no one else did. That's what broke this open. Don't ever forget that." Nina looked into the lawyer's eyes, then into Clay's. For the first time since her family's fire, she felt steady, like she stood on ground that would not give way beneath her. She whispered, more to herself than anyone else, "The truth leaves a trail." Ranger sighed, laying his head across her lap, as if to say the trail had finally led them out of the dark. The trial drew the entire town into the courthouse, its brick walls suddenly feeling like the center of the world. Maple Ridge had never seen such a crowd. Neighbors who once whispered at the diner now pressed into benches, waiting to watch the story unravel in front of a judge. Reporters from Atlanta lined the back, microphones poised, their lenses flashing at every turn of the door. Nina sat at the front with Clay and Maria, her hands clasped tight, Ranger curled beneath her feet. Though the old dog had no place in court by law, the sheriff himself had bent the rules, saying, "He's part of this case as much as anyone." Nina drew comfort from the steady weight of Ranger's head on her shoes, his breath slow and constant, a reminder she wasn't alone. Brenda entered in a gray suit, pearls still at her throat, her hair neat, her face calm. She might have been walking into a Sunday service. But the shackles at her wrists clinked softly, betraying the mask. Dan Waller followed, sullen and glaring, his bulk hunched into the defense table. The prosecutor began with the camera footage, the grainy clip of Dan slipping the envelope into Brenda's hands. The room buzzed at the sight, murmurs rippling through the benches. Then came Willis, the maintenance worker, his voice shaking as he described the unplugged smoke detectors, the log entry proving negligence. And then the ledgers, page after page of names, payments, coded entries that told the story Brenda had hidden for years. Maria whispered encouragement to Nina, but the girl's stomach still twisted as she waited for her turn. When the bailiff called her name, the world seemed to shrink. She walked to the witness stand, her palms sweating, her knees unsteady. Ranger whined softly from under Clay's bench, as if urging her forward. Nina swore the oath, her voice barely above a whisper, then raised her eyes to the courtroom. Faces stared back. Townsfolk who had pitied her, doubted her, ignored her. She felt their weight but also their need. They needed her words to stitch together the cracks in the story, to make sense of the mask they had all worshipped. She drew in a breath. "My name is Nina Harper. I'm 15 years old. For a year I lived in Brenda Miller's house. It wasn't a home. It was a cage." She spoke slowly, every word scraped from her chest. She told them about the fire, the promises, the locked doors, the girls who vanished into the night. She told them about the bruises, the whispers, the fear. When her voice shook, she forced herself to keep going. "She told me I was lucky. She told me no one would believe me, and for a long time, I believed her." Her gaze slid to the jury, to the older faces lined with years of small-town life. "But you heard his voice." She nodded toward Dan. "You saw the footage, you read the logs. This isn't just my story, this is truth. And no child should have to be brave just to feel safe." Silence followed her words, heavy and profound. Even the reporters lowered their pens for a moment. Nina stepped down, her chest heaving, her hands trembling, but she had not broken. Clay reached for her shoulder, Maria's eyes glistened, and Ranger's tail thumped once against the floor. When Brenda rose to speak, her voice carried that same syrupy calm she had used for years. "I loved every child who came into my home," she said, her eyes shining with false tears. "This girl is confused, traumatized. I only ever tried to help." But the mask no longer fit. The jury had seen the footage, heard the logs, felt the tremor in Nina's words. The cross-examination revealed holes in Brenda's story so wide they could no longer be patched with charm. Dan, cornered by the evidence, eventually muttered a plea deal, admitting his role in exchange for leniency. The moment he confessed, the courtroom gasped. The serpent uncoiled. And the saint's halo shattered. Days later, the verdict came. Guilty on charges of child endangerment, human trafficking, obstruction. Brenda's sentence was long, her pearls stripped away, her mask discarded. Dan was led away in chains, his truck seized, his name forever stained. Nina sat through it all, silent, her hands clenched in clays. She did not smile when the sentence was read. Justice was not joy, it was weight lifted, a stone rolled off her chest. When the judge dismissed the court, reporters swarmed. But Clay shielded her, guiding her out into the sunlight. The courthouse bell tolled the hour, deep and resonant, echoing across the square. People gathered outside, their faces etched with shock and sorrow. Some approached Nina, shame in their eyes. "We should have seen," one woman whispered, clutching her hand. "We should have listened." Nina nodded, not with anger but with weary understanding. She had no strength left for blame. That evening, the town council met on the courthouse steps, pledging reforms to foster care oversight, new checks, stricter supervision. For once, promises did not sound empty. They sounded like lessons learned in blood and smoke. Weeks later, the town erected a simple plaque in the square, for the children who spoke too late. Nina stood before it, the autumn wind tugging at her hair, Ranger pressed against her side. Clay laid a hand on her shoulder, his voice low. "You gave them a voice, Nina. You changed this town." She looked at the plaque, then at her scarred wrist, the faint line from the fire that had begun it all. From her pocket she pulled the bracelet fashioned from the old fire hose. Its rough weave worn smooth by her fingers. She slipped it on, tightening the knot. Her voice, when it came, was steady. "From now on, I won't just survive. I'll be the proof that silence can break." Ranger barked once, sharp and sure, as if sealing the vow. The courthouse bell rang again, carrying her words across Maple Ridge, into every home that had once applauded Brenda Miller, now awakened to the cost of their blindness. And though Nina was only 15, in that moment she stood taller than anyone else in the square, a living reminder that justice is not medals or ceremonies, it is listening when the quietest voice dares to speak.